HMS Centurion was one of 4 King George V class super dreadnoughts built for the Royal Navy in 1910. Displacing around 23,000 tons and armed with 10 13.5-inch guns, she was one of the most powerful dreadnoughts within the Grand Fleet at the start of the Great War. Minus her sister Audacious, she and her sisters served the Royal Navy well in the war. Like most dreadnoughts of the Grand Fleet, she participated in the Battle of Jutland, where she fired only 4 salvos, about 19 shells at the battlecruiser Lützow. At the end of the war, she was sent to the Mediterranean Fleet, where she was put into reserve and paid off, destined to be scrapped, but redesignated as a radio-controlled target ship, taking over for HMS Agamemnon. She was given a refit and conversion that saw her fitted with a radio antenna and converted to diesel. After a brief stint laid up, in 1933 she was further refitted where her guns were removed, and her coal bunkers, not serving a purpose anymore, were filled in to maintain her weight. Centurion went on to take quite the pounding as a target ship. However, as the Second World War kicked off, she transitioned into several new roles. First as a repair ship, next a block ship, and more excitingly, she was made to look like HMS Anson, one of the new King George V class battleships of the 1936 estimates. Centurion's only combat service came in Operation Vigorous, a convoy mission to Malta in June 1942, from Alexandria where she helped to beat off German air attacks. The last part of her life saw her serve as a block ship to form a breakwater for the Mulberry prefabricated harbor near the American sector of the Normandy beachhead. Centurion did not survive the storm of June 19, 1944, and was scrapped in place after the war. We'll discuss her career at a later point, but for now, let's take a better look at the King George V class super dreadnoughts of 1910. This class started off life in 1909, being a development of the Orion class. Essentially, the class was an enlarged version of the Orion class, with the main design distinctions being an increased displacement of 500 tons, with an increase of 13 feet 4 inches in length and 6 inches in beam. The anti-torpedo boat armament was rearranged to give an increased fire ahead, with light splinter protection for guns. Internal protection was more complete. Maximum design speed was raised by about 1 knot. Improved modified bridge work, finally a modified rig with a light pole mast, stepped before the funnel instead of a heavy tripod close abaft. There was to be further discussion on increasing the amount and caliber of the anti-torpedo boat armament, as the size of torpedo boat destroyers, or just destroyers, was becoming even larger. The increase to a 6-inch secondary battery would not occur in the King George V class, likely influenced by Admiral Fisher, who was opposed to the increase. The armament was virtually identical to the Orion class, except for Q turret, which had a wider arc than the Orions, along with the previously mentioned changes to the secondary battery. When it comes to armor, it was more complete than the Orion class, with the longitudinal anti-torpedo bulkheads being continuous between the end of the barbettes. General protection was improved over the Orions, which we will discuss when we get to the ship's particulars. But it should be noted that the secondary armament having splinter protection from the outset of the original design was the first for the Royal Navy, rather than an experiment as found on the Orion-class Conqueror. Now, as for particulars, Centurion was built in Devonport, being laid down in January 1911, launched in November 1911, and commissioned in February 1913. Having a 25,420-ton full load displacement, and as for machinery, Centurion had 18-Yarrow boilers, which gave steam to 2 sets of steam turbines, driving 4 shafts, giving her 27,000 shaft horsepower as designed, and with that, a 20 to 21 knot top speed. As for armament, she carried 10 13.5-inch 45 caliber guns and 5 twin turrets, with 2 forward, 2 aft, and 1 just after the second funnel. She also carried 12 4-inch 50 caliber guns, 1 12-pounder, 4 3-pounders, 5 Maxim machine guns, 10 Lewis guns, 3 21-inch torpedo tubes, 2 beam and 1 stern tube. As for armor, she would have a main belt of 12 inches, an upper belt of between 8 and 9 inches, bulkheads with a maximum thickness of 10 inches, and barbettes with a maximum thickness of 10 inches. As for the turrets, they had a face thickness of 11 inches. The conning tower had a maximum thickness of 11 inches, with the decks varying between 1 and 4 inches. Before Centurion was even commissioned, she ran into some problems, quite literally. While on sea trials in December 1912, she collided with the Italian SS Derna. Unfortunately, the Italian ship went down with all hands, and Centurion sustained some serious damage. Centurion's stem was fractured for about 40 feet, and some frames were bowed in that area, causing her to go back to dry dock for repairs. In May 1913, she was commissioned as part of the 2nd Battle Squadron of the Home Fleet. Over the coming years, she helped with goodwill visits to Germany and France, even being the flagship for the admiral in charge of the 2nd Battle Squadron. With the July crisis and the Royal Navy conducting test mobilizations as an economizing measure rather than the fleet maneuvers, she and the now Grand Fleet went to Scapa Flow to be farther away from the possible threat of German torpedo boat attacks. By early August, with Britain at war, Centurion and the other dreadnoughts could not be stationed in Scapa Flow as it was not safe, considering it was not defended properly or had the capabilities to supply so many vessels at once. So the now Commander-in-Chief, Admiral John Jellicoe, had his ships drilling in the North Sea or moved to fleet anchorages further west like he did with Centurion in the 2nd Battle Squadron. In late October 1914, the 1st and 2nd Battle Squadrons were at 2 anchorages further west, Loch Nakiel on the Isle of Mull on the Scottish west coast, and Loch Swilly on the north of Ireland. Both harbors had narrow and easily defensible entrances, as well as shallow bottoms, making entrances for submarines difficult. After the losses of the Bacanti-class cruisers and the older Hawk in the North Sea due to U-boats, the threat the U-boats presented was realized. However, the threat to the 2nd Battle Squadron was not from U-boats, but mines, as the North German Lloyd liner Berlin had laid mines off Loch Swilly near Tory Island, right in the path of the 2nd Battle Squadron was going to take to conduct gunnery practice. Battle fleet consisted of the firing line, Centurion the flagship, Ajax, and Audacious, while the target line consisted of Orion, Monarch, and Thunderer. On the morning of the 28th, the 2nd Battle Squadron with Audacious third in line maneuvered. As she was turning onto the gunnery range with the official time for the signal given to make the turn at 8:40, and approximately at 8:45, a dull explosion could be felt in Audacious. Due to Admiralty orders to leave as soon as the ship had been hit, Centurion and the other battleships were forced to vacate the area, and Audacious went down about 12 hours later. In the official inquiry, it is suspected that Centurion or Ajax displaced a mine in their wake and inadvertently placed it in the path of Audacious. Centurion, although witnessing the sinking of her sister, had not fired her guns in anger against an enemy. The first time a chance came for a major fleet action was after the first raids on Scarborough, Whitby, and Hartley Pool by the German scouting groups with the High Seas Fleet out in support. The Royal Navy put out to respond to this threat, including Centurion and her sisters. Still, a major fleet action did not materialize, with only the screening forces engaging one another briefly. Leading us to January 1915, when Centurion sortied and supported the battlecruisers for the Battle of Dogger Bank, and I'd recommend my recent video on HMS Tiger for that, link in the description. Centurion did not engage the German forces once again, as the battle developed into a chase between Beatty and Hipper. Besides some refits and being based out of Invergordon as to be closer in case of raids, nothing of note happened for Centurion between 1915 and halfway through 1916, when on May 31st the Battle of Jutland kicked off, where she was part of the 1st Division, and although participating in the battle, she didn't really do all that much. She fired 4 salvos in the battle, around 19 shells, all of them at the battlecruiser Lützow. Centurion did not hit her mark. At around 7:15, Iron Duke, Centurion, Royal Oak, King George V, Temeraire, Superb, and Neptune all reported hits as the British line swept the length of the German line at close ranges. Centurion did not sustain damage in the battle, and had a small refit after the other battle-damaged ships had gone through and gotten repaired. Since no other fleet action occurred during the rest of the war, besides her usual drilling, refits, and patrols, Centurion had an uneventful time. Following the war in 1919, she was part of a few operations like a prisoner of war exchange with the Bolsheviks, and she was sent to the Mediterranean to be part of a newly organized Mediterranean fleet after the Grand Fleet had broken up. 1920, Centurion was temporarily put in reserve at Malta and completed for further service with the fleet in August of that year. However, with the Washington Naval Treaty restrictions, Centurion was on the chopping block, being pretty old by this point, and by April 1926, she was chosen to replace HMS Agamemnon as a radio-controlled target ship. In this role, the ship was only to be targeted for guns up to 8 inches, where in the refit she was stripped of all small fittings and rig, and top weight reduced. Turrets were not initially removed, but later they were determined to be unnecessary after the relevant data about their strength had been determined, and so they were removed. Her machinery remained intact, but she was modified to use diesel oil instead of coal. Since her coal bunkers were useless, and to make sure the ship carried an appropriate amount of weight, they were filled with rocks. However, her draft was somewhat increased, thus allowing her not to be penetrated below the water. In this role, Centurion was fit with many radio antennas, and with the turrets removed, she looked rather unique in this role. She was capable of 16 knots in this role, and through further refits and work that saw the turrets removed, her bridge and superstructure were reduced. Her complement to maintain her was about 240 men or so, and of course, when being a target ship, they were not on board. As a radio-controlled target ship, Centurion was used to test the gunnery of cruisers and even some dive bombers. However, in 1931, she was laid up in reserve as an economizing measure with the Great Depression in full swing. Still, in 1933, she was further refitted to serve in the role of a radio-controlled target ship. In this role, the ship took a tremendous beating, especially by the Atlantic Fleet. And in July 1934, the 1st Cruiser Squadron put their mark on the ship with their 8-inch guns. Throughout the 1930s, she was in and out of repair due to the nature of her duty, wherein she was serving in this role until the start of the Second World War. Centurion, although one of the oldest battleships left to the Royal Navy, albeit without her guns, they still saw value in her. So much so in 1940, there were plans to refit her as some sort of anti-aircraft platform for the Norwegian campaign, and given the losses in the campaign for both sides, it was probably better for Centurion that this didn't happen. Instead, she was transformed into a repair and maintenance ship for the local defense forces and a block ship. Now, Churchill, known for his schemes, came up with one where he wanted the Mediterranean fleet to bombard the harbor of Tripoli on the Libyan coast, which of course would be risky for the Mediterranean fleet to do. Admiral Andrew Cunningham was wary of this, and he became even more wary when Churchill wanted him to sink a battleship in the entrance of the harbor as a block ship. Not wanting to give up any of his, it was suggested that Centurion serve in this role. Thankfully, again for Centurion, this did not happen as the idea was scrapped, and instead, Centurion was chosen for another role. Sometime between 1939 and 1941, the dates are a bit hard to pinpoint as there are conflicting dates with usually reliable sources. Centurion was chosen to be a dummy battleship. This meant that she was given a makeover with fake turrets, superstructure, and other fittings to look like one of the King George V class battleships from the 1936 estimates, HMS Anson. This deception is pretty convincing, and is what Centurion is arguably best known for. The British took an elderly battleship and disguised her as a modern and more powerful battleship, something that had been cooked up by Churchill in the First World War with merchant ships and done to Iron Duke in the Second World War. Although you can pick out the flaws in Centurion's disguise, from the air which it was intended for, it would certainly be hard to tell. In this role, she was fitted with guns again, 2 2-pounders and 8 20mm guns. Later in 1942, given 4 2-pounders and 17 20mm guns. She was going to help in Operation Vigorous, where she and 8 light cruisers, 26 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and 2 minesweepers attempted to escort a convoy under the command of Admiral Philip Vian from Alexandria to Malta. In this, Centurion was attacked by German bombers, helping to shoot down some of them. Vigorous would not reach Malta due to the air attacks and the threat of the Regia Marina. She was to keep this disguise for quite a bit of time, apparently sailing 20,000 miles with it on, at least according to R.A. Burt. However, Centurion did not really have an opportunity to put her excellent costume to work in home waters. Centurion served in one last very important role. Between May and June 1944, she was stripped of all of her equipment at Portsmouth for use as a block ship as part of the breakwater for the Mulberry prefabricated harbor at Omaha Beach. Centurion did not serve in this role for very long, as the storm of June 19, 1944 wrecked her. She broke in two and was scrapped in place following the war. Centurion didn't exactly get to serve her intended purpose as a battleship, with limited engagements with the enemy. Still, she served in important roles through her role as a radio-controlled target ship, as a dummy battleship, and finally as a breakwater for the invasion of France. Which really isn't that bad of an end. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.